Wow, you guys really liked my last video, and well, I love the result too. If you haven't seen it yet, go check it out first. You know, it always feels more satisfying when I manage to get a professional looking result with a budget camera like my Canon M50. What? No. Oh, no. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. Look, a lot of people think that you're the best camera that came out last year. You know what? This week we'll shoot something, you know? Just the two of us. Oh, my Sony was jealous, but we're good now, we're good. So let me give you 5 tips to make your cheap camera, your budget camera, look more professional. And you can apply these tips to your photography and your filmmaking. Okay, now look guys, that discussion, gear matters, gear doesn't matter, it's a never-ending discussion, right? But let's be honest, this camera, my Canon M50, 8-bit color, low dynamic range, no log, it will never look exactly the same as a super expensive cinema camera or my Sony a7S III. That's just a fact. But that doesn't mean that it looks bad, not at all, and it's also super subjective. There's more to a good video than high dynamic range and 10-bit color. But there are a few things that you can do to make a cheap camera, a budget camera, look more expensive, more professional, more cinematic, whatever you want to call it. This is where it all starts, guys. Look, I have nothing against shooting in auto mode. You can get good results that way, but if you want to take it to the next level, if you want to go from good results to great results, then you have to learn how to shoot in manual mode. You have to know how your camera works. And I'm not saying that you have to learn what every button and every setting does. I don't even know what every button and every setting does, but the basics. Exposure, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. That's the foundation. And more specifically, how those 3 settings behave in relation to each other when you adjust one. What happens when you increase the aperture, for example? What happens to the exposure? And how can you compensate that by adjusting one of the other settings? That's really important. And when you're into filmmaking, you should also add frame rates into that mix. The mix of settings that you have to learn. Knowing exactly how those basic settings work makes all the difference, because your camera doesn't always make the right decisions. If you want the best possible result, then you have to make the decisions depending on what you're shooting and what you want the result to look like, what you want the story to be. You have to make those creative decisions, and you can only do that if you know those basic settings. Aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and frame rates. That's where it all starts. And then we have, well, I'm gonna call it intention, because I'm not sure what to call it. What I mean is that for professionals or people who've been into photography and filmmaking for a long time, it's very easy to spot the difference between a professional and a beginner, just by looking at their work, even when both are shooting on the same camera. And I'll go even further, even when the beginner nails the exposure and delivers a technically perfect image with the best color grading, it's still easy to spot the difference between the beginner and the professional. And that's because usually beginners don't think before they shoot, they just do randomly. It's really difficult to explain. Look, when I'm watching a movie or when I go to a photography exhibition, for example, I'm constantly thinking like, wow, I love how they did it like this, or how they used this angle because it makes it look more like this or that. You know what I mean? And that's it. Professionals do certain things intentionally because they know that it will give them the desired result, the result that they're looking for. Another example, when a tourist wants to take a photo of a building, for example, usually it's like building, click, photo, done, right? But when a pro takes that photo, or not even a pro, a seasoned amateur, someone who knows what they're doing, they'll be like, let me think first. How should I do this? Should I take this angle? Should I maybe wait for the sun to go down a little bit? Should I use that plant over there in the foreground of my photo to make it look more dynamic? That's the difference between pros and beginners. But it's something you can learn. Your work will look more professional when it looks intentional. This was a difficult one. This is not easy. We're going like next level here, guys, next level. But this is really important. Okay, next tip. Okay, so when I say light, I don't mean exposure. A while ago, I made a video about the difference between exposure and ratios. It's fairly easy to get a good exposure, but that doesn't mean that your photo will look good, or your video. For example, in my cola commercial, the blue light in the background was set at 15%. Now, I could have just as well set it at 40% and still get a perfectly exposed image. But the result would look totally different because then I wouldn't get that blue halo around the can. The whole background would look blue. So you can decide if a well-exposed image looks flat and boring or interesting and dynamic with lots of depth and layers. Even when you're shooting outside in natural sunlight, you can decide to wait until the sun sets, for example. The thing is, cheaper cameras usually have less dynamic range, but that's something you can fix by lighting your subject properly, or when shooting outside by picking the right time of day to shoot, when the contrast is lower. When your camera doesn't have a lot of dynamic range, like my M50, it's always better to shoot in low contrast situations, because it can't handle those high contrast situations. And you're gonna blow the highlights or crush the blacks, and that does look more amateur. It looks like it's shot on a cheaper camera. So you can compensate that lack in dynamic range with good lighting. Composition. It's a classic, but it's super important, no matter how cheap or expensive your camera is. And nailing the composition when shooting on a cheap camera will make it look better. That's just how it is. It will look more professional. A well-composed image will always win from a technically perfect image without a good composition. So when you're shooting on a cheap camera, you have to make sure to nail the composition, because then people won't notice the details that the image is not technically perfect. Now, I'm not saying that when you're shooting on an expensive camera, composition doesn't matter. No, that's like, you know, no. And finally, we have color grading. And color grading is tricky because, first of all, it's difficult. You know, skin tones, luminance, shadows, highlights, all those color wheels and little sliders you can pull and push, and it's difficult. So when you're starting out, don't worry too much about it. But it's always good to start learning the basics, you know, bit by bit. For example, again, my cola commercial, we all know that when you upload something to YouTube, the compression messes with the contrast and the colors. It's annoying, but we just have to deal with it. So sometimes, because I know that, I do a test upload to check if the colors don't shift too much. Now, when I uploaded that commercial, this is what it looked like. See the reds? Totally faded, no punch at all. And that's not what it looks like in my editing program at all. Now, when you do something like a cola commercial, that red, that Coca-Cola red, is super important to get right, or at least as close as possible. So what I did is, I increased the saturation of the reds in my video to compensate for that loss of saturation after I upload the video onto YouTube. And it's little things like that that can make the footage out of your budget camera look more professional. And that's it, guys. So if you have a cheap camera, don't let it hold you back at all. An expensive camera does have some advantages and more possibilities, but you can definitely make the footage and the videos coming out of your budget camera look more professional and, yeah, more expensive. Because there's more to a good video than just having high dynamic range and 10-bit color. I hope you've learned something. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.